What would you do if your HOA marched onto your private lake and demanded you pay them $250 a month, or leave your own land? I was standing on my dock at sunrise when their president handed me that fake invoice, acting like she owned the water I'd paid for outright. Something in her eyes told me this wasn't about a fee at all. It was a warning and a challenge. And if she wanted a fight over my lake, she was about to learn why you don't corner a man on his own property. The dawn over Wyoming has a particular kind of stillness, one that settles into your bones before your mind fully wakes. That morning, the sky was a pale silver sheet stretching over Cedar Ridge, and the fog drifted low across my lake like a slow-moving ghost. I'd been sitting on the edge of my wooden dock for almost an hour, boots planted on old timber soaked with decades of sunrise, fishing rod resting loosely in my hand. The water barely rippled. Even the trout seemed to respect the quiet. The only sounds were the soft clicks of my reel and the distant creak of pine branches bending under their own weight. This lake had been my refuge ever since I bought the surrounding acreage, a place where the wind didn't judge and the water held whatever thoughts I didn't want to say out loud. Out here, soul and land settled together. That's what I believed, at least until that morning. I heard it before I saw her, the unmistakable rhythm of heels on wood, sharp and out of place against the damp, weather-worn planks. Tap, tap, tap. Each step cut through the silence like a pebble in a mirror-smooth pond. I turned my head slowly, already feeling the peace drain out of my chest. Bethany Reed, the president of the Pine Brook Meadows HOA, was striding toward me as if she owned the very air around my dock. She wore a cream blazer, far too clean for Wyoming dawn, and had her hair styled in that stiff, sculpted way people use to signal they don't bend for anyone. She didn't say hello, she didn't even glance at the lake. She just kept walking until she stood 3 feet away, blocking the early sun like some judgmental monument. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice tight and bright at the same time, the way someone sounds when they've practiced their lines beforehand. She held out a folded piece of paper. "You've been notified." I blinked once, more confused than anything else. Notified of what? My voice stayed calm, slow, Wyoming slow. Years on ranches teach you not to startle easily. She extended the paper closer, impatient. "Lake usage fee, $250 per month. Your payment is due in 10 days, or you'll be in violation." I stared at her for a second, wondering if I'd misunderstood her words, or if she truly believed the nonsense she was saying. I took the paper without standing up. The edges were crisp, too crisp. I unfolded it on my knee. There was no letterhead, no official stamp. Not even the HOA's name printed at the top. Just big, bold text demanding money for the continued recreational privilege of accessing Cedar Lake. My lake. My deed. My water rights. My property line that circled the entire shoreline like a closed fist. The mist rose between us, curling around the dock's handrail. I felt the cold bite of morning air tighten across my shoulders as I read the invoice again, slower this time. It looked like something whipped up on a home printer at midnight by someone who didn't think they'd ever be questioned. I lifted my eyes to Bethany. "This lake isn't part of Pine Brook Meadows," I said evenly. "It never has been." Her smile thinned, turning sharp around the edges. "Mr. Cole, the lake has always been considered a shared community resource. Your recent purchase doesn't change that. You may own the land, but the water, well, that's different." It took everything in me to keep my breath steady. I set my fishing rod down beside me, feeling the old dock shift under my weight as I finally stood. "Bethany, this lake sits fully on private property, my property. You can check the county survey yourself." She folded her arms, chin tilting upward like she was staring down a stage actor who missed his cue. "Our residents have enjoyed access for decades. It's only fair that you contribute to the upkeep of what everyone uses. Upkeep? I let out a humorless breath. There's no public access, no HOA maintenance. Not a single HOA dollar has touched this shoreline. Her eyes flashed with something. Annoyance, maybe frustration, maybe both. She took one tiny half-step forward. Mr. Cole, I'm simply doing what our bylaws require. You can cooperate, or the board will take further action. I looked past her, at the water turning from silver to pale blue as the sun climbed. This place had been the one quiet corner in my life since losing my father last winter, since inheriting the land he'd fought to protect. The last thing I expected was someone marching down my dock and telling me I owed them money for breathing the air above my own lake. I refolded the paper slowly, purposefully. There's no legal basis for this, I said, and you know it. Bethany straightened, disappointment melting into a colder kind of resolve. We'll see, she said softly. She turned on her heel and walked back toward the road, every step echoing a little harder than it needed to across the wooden planks. The fog swallowed her silhouette bit by bit until she disappeared entirely. I stayed rooted in place, the invoice still in my hand. The morning felt different now, no longer peaceful but disturbed, like someone had stirred silt from the bottom of the lake and clouded what had been perfectly clear. Why would the HOA think they could fine me for something I owned outright? And more importantly, why did Bethany Reed look so confident when she said they could? The fog thinned as the sun finally broke over the ridge, pulling long shadows across the dock. I folded the invoice and slipped it into my jacket, then walked back toward the cabin, boots pressing into damp earth, leaving faint outlines on the dew-covered grass. My old cedar cabin sat 40 yards from the shoreline, its roof still glistening from the night frost. The porch boards creaked the same way they always did when I stepped onto them, but somehow the sound didn't comfort me the way it usually did. Inside, the living room smelled faintly of coffee and pine wood. A half-finished mug sat on the table beside my father's old toolbox, the kind of metal box ranchers kept their whole life, dented, dusty, and nearly impossible to throw away. I set my keys down, unzipped my jacket, and spread the invoice on the wooden dining table beneath the window. Morning light spilled across the page, revealing just how bare the document truly was. No seal, no signature, no citation, nothing that tied it to the county or even to the HOA itself. Just a number, $250, and the audacity to call it a usage fee. I reached for the drawer where I kept my paperwork. The metal runner screeched as I pulled it open. Slowly, I stack out the deed, the county survey maps, and the water rights certification the previous owner, old Mr. Halverson, had meticulously maintained for decades. I remembered the day I'd bought the property. Halverson had insisted I walk the boundary with him, pointing his cane at every corner marker like a general inspecting his lines. "Water's yours," he'd said, "not theirs. Remember that." I spread the documents across the table. My finger traced the heavy red boundary line on the survey. Every inch of Cedar Lake sat within the property's contours. No HOA access, no shared easement, no historic agreement. Nothing. The invoice lying beside it felt almost laughable now, except Bethany hadn't looked like she was joking. There had been something chilling in her confidence, something suggesting she expected me to back down without even checking the facts. I sat down, leaning my elbows on the table. The room was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional whisper of wind pushing against the porch screens. I read through the invoice 3 times. Every pass only raised more questions. Why no letterhead? Why no bylaw reference? Why issue a fee with no legal foundation? The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, not from fear, but from a sense that I was stepping into something larger than one sheet of paper. I grabbed my phone and opened the HOA's website. Their bylaws were posted online, buried under a clunky menu labeled Governing Documents. I clicked through. The PDF took a moment to load, the screen flickering in the cool morning light. I scrolled, and scrolled, and scrolled. 53 pages. Not a single reference to Cedar Lake. Not a single claim that it was part of the association. No maintenance responsibilities. No access rules. Nothing. It was as if the lake didn't exist in their world at all, until I bought it. I pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping against the wooden floor. A cold realization settled in my gut. If Bethany knew the lake wasn't in the bylaws, and she had to know, then the invoice wasn't about rules. It was about pressure, or intimidation, or both. The kind of move someone makes when they think the other person won't fight back. I walked to the small cabinet beside the front door where I kept my security equipment. My father used to joke that ranchers didn't need cameras, just good neighbors. But neighbors had changed. People had changed. So I took a different approach when I moved here. I opened the cabinet and pulled out my trail camera kit. I'd installed several cameras around the property, mostly for wildlife. But after this morning, I wanted to be sure every angle was covered. I checked the recordings. Nothing unusual. No visits in the night. No strange vehicles pulling up. Just the quiet rustling of deer and the flicker of branches. My stomach growled faintly, reminding me I hadn't eaten breakfast, but I ignored it. Instead, I grabbed the deed and reread the water rights section, letting the crisp paper slide between my fingers. The language was clear. Exclusive use, exclusive access, exclusive stewardship. It had taken me months of negotiation to secure this land, and I wasn't about to let a homeowners association, one I wasn't even part of, waltz in and demand payment for something they didn't own. I folded everything neatly and returned it to the drawer, except for the invoice. That stayed on the table, staring up at me like a dare. As I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, I replayed Bethany's expression in my mind. That self-assured tilt of her head, that scripted tone, that little pause before she said violation, as if savoring the power of the word. Confidence like that didn't come from ignorance. It came from habit. From a system she'd used before. From people folding before her. But I wasn't most people. I stood by the window, watching the lake through the glass as the fog lifted completely. The water now glimmered in the sun, pristine and quiet, untouched except for the soft breeze gliding across its surface. A place like that deserved peace, and so did I. So why was the HOA acting like this lake belonged to them? What made Bethany Reed think she could walk onto my dock, hand me a fake invoice, and expect me to bow my head? Something didn't add up, and the longer I stared at that water, the more certain I became that the invoice was only the beginning of something hadn't yet seen. Something deeper. Something older. Or something planned. I set down my coffee, took a slow breath, and looked back at the invoice one more time. If the HOA had no authority here, if the lake wasn't in their bylaws, if the invoice wasn't legal, then why issue it at all? And more importantly, what were they trying to pull me into? The stillness outside felt different again, heavier, charged with a kind of quiet warning that settled low in my chest. I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever Bethany Reed wanted from my lake, she wasn't done trying to get it. By mid-morning, the sky had sharpened from soft silver to a hard Wyoming blue. The breeze that skimmed across the surface of the lake carried a crisp chill, sliding through the cottonwoods and rattling the wind chimes my father made from old ranch hardware. They clinked a nervous tune as I stepped onto the porch with my coffee in hand. I needed clarity. Instead, I got an email. The phone buzzed in my pocket, too harsh for a quiet morning like this. When I unlocked the screen, the HOA's digital letterhead filled it. Pine trees, elegant serif fonts, all of it pretending to be more official than it actually was. The subject line read, Community Update. Addressing concerning behavior at Cedar Lake. My jaw tightened as I read. The message accused me of restricting traditional community access, of intentionally disrupting harmony, and of displaying hostility toward long-standing residents. It painted me like some outsider who had stormed into their world and locked the gates behind me. I scrolled further. Someone, clearly Bethany, had written a paragraph implying that Cedar Lake was a shared historical landmark used for generations by the neighborhood. That line made something hot crawl up the back of my neck. The neighborhood was barely 15 years old. My lake had been recorded as private property for 52. And then I hit the sentence that made me exhale slowly through my nose. Community members are encouraged to report any aggressive or concerning actions. Aggressive. Concerning. Words chosen not by accident. They weren't just building a story. They were building a case. I lowered the phone and stared out at the lake through the porch screen. The water was calm as glass, but I felt the storm tightening beneath it. I set the phone down on the table beside the railing. For a long minute, I didn't move. Just breathed. Slow. Controlled. The way my father taught me when something on the ranch went wrong, and panic only made it worse. When I finally picked the phone up again, another alert popped across the top of the screen, this one from the neighborhood's message board. I didn't even know they had a message board, but apparently I'd been discussed enough to warrant a mention. The first post was titled, "New Lake Owner Causing Problems." A few comments trickled underneath it. "Why move here if you don't want to be part of the community? He's from out of state, right? Figures. Always fished there before. No idea why he thinks he's special." I rubbed a hand slowly down my face. These people had never said a word to me. Not a hello. Not a wave. And now, suddenly, I was the villain who had committed the unforgivable crime of owning something they wanted. The shift was fast. Too fast to be organic. This wasn't neighborly concern. This was coordinated. I went back inside, closing the screen door with a soft thump. The house felt different now, as if the walls themselves were bracing. The smell of pine, usually grounding, felt heavier, as though the air had thickened with unwelcome tension. I opened my laptop and logged into my email again, this time searching the spam folder. If the HOA claimed to have sent a policy change about the lake, I wanted to see it. But there was nothing. No announcements, no amendments, no meeting notes, no warning. Nothing but a digital tide rising against me. I clicked to the next tab and opened my security app. The cameras had captured a few deer overnight, a pair of foxes at dawn. Nothing else. No neighbors walking by. No HOA members creeping up the road. The silence didn't comfort me. It concerned me. Whatever Bethany was planning, she was planning off stage. I leaned back in my chair, letting the tension settle in my shoulders. The late morning light spilled across the wooden floor, catching dust motes that danced in the warmth. I used to love that sight. Today, it felt like distraction. I returned to the message board and scrolled deeper. One post stopped me cold. "We shouldn't let him shut us out. Cedar Lake has always been part of who we are." Always been part of who we are. The line triggered something. A memory. When I bought the land, the real estate agent mentioned, offhand, that some neighbors liked to kayak there sometimes, but that the property had always been privately held, and the previous owner, old Mr. Halverson, occasionally let them use it if they asked nicely. Occasionally, not legally, not by right, and not as a tradition. I clicked on the commenter's profile. A man named Roger, someone I'd only exchanged nods with when driving past the mailboxes. His photo showed him holding a kayak paddle, smiling in front of a lake that, sure enough, was mine. My fingers tightened around the mouse. So that was it. They weren't just upset about losing access. They were upset about losing entitlement. They thought their casual use had become something permanent, something owed. And Bethany, with her crisp blazer and sharper ambitions, was fanning that sense of ownership like a flame in dry brush. I took a slow breath, let it out through my nose, then grabbed my phone and started photographing every post, every comment, every email. Digital evidence, time-stamped and saved. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Ranchers learn early that you document everything, because you never know when someone will claim they were there first. The wind outside picked up, brushing against the cabin with a hollow, rushing sound. The old cedar boards answered with a low groan. I walked to the window and watched the lake again, the same stretch of water that had been quiet just hours ago, now feeling like the center of a conflict I didn't ask for. My eyes followed the shoreline, the pine trees reflected in the water, the faint shimmer of early sun. The lake didn't look different, but everything around it felt changed. Someone once told me tension is like ice forming. It doesn't happen all at once. It starts thin, invisible. Then one day you realize the whole surface is hard enough to stand on. And that's what this felt like. A thin layer had already formed. More was coming. I closed the curtains, shutting out the accusing calm of the lake. My house fell into a dim, muted light. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the shift, a move from confusion to alertness, instinct sharpening, breath steadying. They wanted a narrative. They wanted a villain. They wanted someone to blame for losing something they never owned. Fine. Let them talk. But the more noise they made, the clearer their intentions became. Something was building beneath all this tradition talk, something Bethany hadn't said openly yet, and I intended to find out exactly what it was. The afternoon sun had begun its slow drop behind the ridge when I stepped back outside. The wind had picked up, threading through the pines and carrying the faint scent of dust from the old service road that ran along the northern edge of my property. I walked down the porch steps, feeling the boards flex under my boots, and followed the gravel path toward my storage shed. Every sound felt sharper than usual, the crunch of stones, the rustle of leaves, even my own breathing. I needed answers, not speculation. Inside the shed, the light filtered through gaps in the metal siding, cutting the dimness into long, pale stripes. Dust particles floated lazily, turning in the shafts of light as though moving with purpose. I reached for the heavy file box on the top shelf, county records, old surveys, and whatever past owners had left behind. Halverson was meticulous about paperwork, almost obsessive. If there was a clue in the history of this lake, he would have kept it. I carried the box outside and set it on the tailgate of my truck. A gust swept across the field, flipping open the lid with a soft thump. Folders leaned against one another like an overfilled bookshelf. I shuffled through them, fingers brushing brittle paper edges and faded yellow tabs. Property taxes, well maintenance logs, a 50-year-old fish stocking record, another survey map. Then one folder caught my eye. It was stuffed thicker than the others, the tab handwritten, HOA requests and offers. My pulse tightened. I opened it. Inside were copies of letters addressed to Halverson, all from Pinebrook Meadows HOA, or rather, from its earlier board under different names. Some were polite requests asking whether the community might discuss shared access. Others were thinly veiled attempts to pressure him into allowing recreational use. And then I found the one that stopped my breath. A formal offer to purchase Cedar Lake, dated 5 years ago. The HOA had offered $190,000 for the lake and surrounding shoreline. The letter insisted the community needed to protect long-term water access. Halverson's reply was stapled to the back. Not for sale. Ever. The old man had written those words in thick pen strokes deep enough to dent the page. I flipped deeper into the folder. 3 more offers came over the next 2 years, each one higher, each one signed by a different board president. But one name appeared multiple times, once as a board member, later rising to vice president, Bethany Reed. My chest tightened. The pieces didn't fit, they snapped together. This wasn't about tradition. It wasn't about community harmony. It was about acquisition. The HOA had wanted the lake long before I arrived, and Bethany had been part of that effort from the beginning. But if they'd tried to buy it before, why the sudden push now? I closed the folder slowly, my mind turning through possibilities. Money, development, water rights. Something bigger had to be at stake. I locked the shed and walked along the fence line toward the western ridge where the property overlooked the entire lake. The late-day sun lit the water in a copper glow, the surface smooth and glassy except for the occasional ripple from a trout rising near the shallows. Then, from the corner of my eye, something moved at the far end of the road. A black pickup truck had pulled onto the shoulder, angled toward the lake. It didn't belong to any of the neighbors. I knew every truck, SUV, and rusted sedan in the area. This one was newer, clean, dark-tinted windows. It idled quietly, engine humming like a distant generator. As I watched, a man stepped out, leaned against the hood, and took a long look at the water. He wasn't dressed like a rancher. No boots, no weathered denim. Instead, he wore dark slacks, a pressed shirt, and expensive sunglasses. He wasn't sightseeing. He was surveying. After a minute, he reached into the truck bed and pulled out something metallic. Binoculars. He raised them to his face and scanned the shoreline slowly, deliberately, my shoreline, my waterline, my dock. A cold prickle ran down my spine. I recognized the truck model. Not the plates, but the custom lift and chrome trim. I'd seen one just like it parked in front of a development site 2 towns over, a signboard reading Mercer Land and Water Projects. Jake Mercer, a regional developer known for snapping up land with high water value and turning it into luxury communities. The kind of man who didn't show interest in a lake unless he smelled profit. My jaw clenched. So this was the reason behind Bethany's sudden bravado. This was the fuel behind the HOA's revival of tradition. And this was why she acted like my refusal wasn't a dead end. They had a buyer lined up. Or worse, they had a plan to take what they couldn't buy. From my vantage point on the ridge, the wind carried the faint sound of Mercer's truck door slamming shut. He climbed back in, and the tires kicked up dust as the vehicle rolled away, disappearing behind the line of spruce trees near the southern road. The quiet returned, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the moment before thunder, air swelling, pressure building, waiting for the break. As I walked back toward the cabin, my boots dug deeper into the dirt than before. Each step felt heavier, as though the land itself was trying to warn me. When I reached the porch, I turned once more to look at the lake. The surface was darker now, shadows from the ridge creeping across it. The truth was beginning to surface. Bethany hadn't just wanted the lake because of some sentimental neighborhood story. She wasn't protecting tradition, and she certainly wasn't enforcing rules. She had already tried and failed to buy it. And now, with Mercer circling like a hawk, she had every reason to twist the HOA's power into something sharper, something that could corner me the way she couldn't corner Halverson. The breeze picked up again, scattering a few pine needles across the porch. I stood in the doorway, the file folder still gripped tightly in my hand, and felt the weight of what I'd uncovered settle deep. This wasn't about a fee. It wasn't even about access. It was a second attempt to take the lake. Only this time, the HOA wasn't coming with a check. They were coming with a strategy. And now that I knew the truth, I had to decide how to fight it. The next few days passed with an uneasy rhythm. The mornings stayed cold and sharp, the wind carrying the early scent of spring runoff from the mountains. Snowmelt trickled down the gullies behind my cabin, soaking the ground in soft mud and making the earth smell fresh, alive. But underneath that rebirth was something darker. A quiet tension that followed me from room to room, trail to trail, like a shadow that refused to detach. I didn't have to wait long to see the next move. It happened at sunrise on a Thursday, the same hour I usually walked down to the dock with a thermos of coffee. The sky was pale gold, stretched thin across the ridge like someone had pulled a warm blanket over the cold night. Everything felt normal at first. The lake was calm. The pines stood like dark spears against the sky. Ducks glided near the far shore. But something moved in the corner of my eye. Bright flashes of orange and red, unnatural colors against the steel-blue water. Kayaks. 4 of them, gliding across my lake like they belonged there. For a moment, I just stood at the top of the path, my boots rooted in the dirt. I could hear their voices, light, casual, laughing as if they were out on a public river. The colorful hulls carved soft ripples through the water, sending lazy waves toward my dock. My jaw tightened. I took the path down to the lake, each step crunching on the gravel. The sun was still low, throwing long beams through the trees, illuminating the scene in a way that felt almost unreal. The kayakers were now drifting toward the center of the lake. One of them, the one in the bright red kayak, looked my way but didn't stop paddling. I recognized him. Roger, the same man from the message board who had accused me of shutting out the community. His hat read Pine Brook Paddle Club. Another woman in a yellow kayak snapped photos with her phone, turning her lens toward the waterline, the boathouse, even my cabin beyond the trees. Documenting. For what purpose, I didn't yet know. I walked down the last few steps of the path and onto the dock. The wood groaned under my weight, the sound echoing faintly across the lake. The kayakers slowed when they got close enough to hear me without shouting. "Morning," I called out, my voice level, controlled. "I need to let you know you're on private water." The group exchanged glances. The woman with the phone lowered it slightly. "Oh, Bethany told us it was fine," she said. "She said the lake wasn't included in your sale, that it's—" what was the word? "Detached from land ownership." I felt something cold slide into my chest. Roger nodded in agreement. "Yeah, she said the shoreline belongs to you, sure, but the water itself is community access. She said it's been that way for years." The lies were growing, not just in frequency, but in confidence. I kept my breath steady. "The lake, the water rights, and the surrounding land belong to me," I said, not raising my voice. "It's all on record with the county. There's no public easement, no shared access. You were misinformed." They shifted uneasily. Roger's paddle scraped the water as he drifted a little farther from me, uncertainty creeping into his face. "Well, that's not what we heard." I pulled my phone from my pocket, not abruptly, not threatening, just enough for them to see. Its camera was already active. "You're free to leave," I said calmly, "but I'm recording this interaction for documentation." The woman's shoulders slumped. "Okay," she murmured. She began turning her kayak toward the public boat ramp half a mile south. The others followed, paddling slower than before, their earlier confidence bleeding away as they moved. By the time they disappeared behind the curve of the shoreline, the lake was still again. Quiet again. But not peaceful. I stood there on the dock for a long moment, letting the cold air settle around me. The water lapped against the posts, each wave small but steady, like the heartbeat of a place that had been violated. I didn't feel anger, not the explosive kind. What I felt was narrower, sharper, a thin, cold blade of resolve. Bethany hadn't just encouraged the kayakers, she had weaponized them, turning regular neighbors into pawns to strengthen her fiction about tradition. She sent them out here not to enjoy the lake, but to test my reaction. Maybe to provoke me. Maybe to claim I'd acted aggressively. Or maybe to gather proof that she could twist later. I walked back up the path, the gravel shifting under my boots, and reached the cabin just as the sun climbed fully above the ridge. The front door swung open with a familiar creak. Inside, the air still held the warmth of the wood-burning stove from the night before, but it couldn't shake the cold sense building at the base of my spine. I sat at the table and replayed the footage. Every second. Every word. It was all clear. No raised voice, no threats, nothing that could be misconstrued. As I saved it to my cloud folder labeled HOA dispute, another memory surfaced. The way Roger had said, "That's not what we heard." He wasn't lying. He truly believed it. That meant Bethany had already begun spreading her rewritten version of reality. A version where the lake was theirs, where I was the intruder, where my ownership was irrelevant. A strategy. I rubbed a hand across my jaw. This wasn't just escalation. It was preparation for something larger. Something designed to corner me more publicly, more forcefully. Just as I stood to refill my coffee, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, deliberate. Not hurried, not frantic. When I stepped onto the porch, Bethany Reed was waiting at the bottom of the steps, her hands clasped calmly in front of her, as though she'd been expecting me all along. Behind her, 2 more HOA board members stood with clipboards in hand. "Mr. Cole?" Bethany called up to me, her tone all honey and frost. "We need to discuss your recent hostility toward our residents." I didn't speak. I didn't move. I simply held her gaze, letting the cold Wyoming wind cut through the space between us as she prepared her next attempt to take what wasn't hers. The lake shimmered behind her shoulders, bright and clear. The truth was buried beneath her lies, but not for long. The breeze carried the faint scent of lake water and thawing earth, the early signs of spring creeping through the chill. Bethany stood at the foot of my porch steps like she owned the place, her blazer catching bits of sunlight, her hair perfectly unmoved by the Wyoming gusts. Behind her, the 2 board members shifted their weight awkwardly, clipboard warriors waiting for instructions. I didn't invite her up. I didn't speak first. I didn't need to. The silence did more damage than any words I could have thrown. She cleared her throat with a practiced grace. "Mr. Cole, our residents have expressed serious concerns about your behavior. You've confronted kayakers, inhibited recreational use, and created a hostile environment." Another gust of wind swept across the property, snapping the loose strand of a wind chime against its metal neighbors. The sharp ring echoed between us. I stayed quiet. Bethany's smile stretched a little too tight. "We'd like your cooperation to resolve these tensions. You can either restore community access, or we'll be forced to take further action. I'd prefer not to escalate matters, of course." I finally spoke, but only 2 words. "Document it." Her expression froze. My voice stayed level. The kind of steady tone Wyoming men slip into when they stop pretending to be agreeable. "Anything you're accusing me of, anything you're demanding, put it in writing. Signed, cited, recorded." Behind her, the board members looked at each other. One shifted his clipboard, unsure whether to write or retreat. Bethany's jaw tightened. Verbal communication should suffice. "No," I said plainly. "Not anymore." The wind picked up again, rattling the pine branches like bones clicking high above us. Bethany tried to take a step forward, but I subtly shifted my weight. Not aggressive, just a reminder that this was my land, my steps, my threshold. She paused. I didn't blink. Something inside her calculation faltered. Just a fraction. But I saw it. The smallest crack in that professional facade. "Very well," she said finally, her voice clipped. The board will convene. Expect correspondence." She turned sharply, signaling the two board members to follow her back down the gravel path. Their shoes crunched awkwardly, city soles on country ground. When they reached the end of the drive, her white SUV blinked as she unlocked it, the sun glaring off the windshield like a warning flare. I stood there until her tires kicked up dust, until the sound of the engine faded behind the ridge, until the wind reclaimed the quiet she'd disrupted. Only then did I exhale. Inside the cabin, the air held a faint aroma of cedar and warm ash. I closed the door behind me, feeling the familiar give of the old wooden frame. My heart wasn't racing, but my mind was running like a creek after snowmelt. They were escalating, but doing it sideways, not through law, through pressure, whispers, and a constructed narrative. They needed me to react, to lose control, to give them something they could twist. Instead, I gave them silence. Silence unnerved people like Bethany. I walked over to the kitchen counter where my father's old leather-bound notebook lay. I flipped it open, the pages yellowed, corners softened by years of weather and use. Inside were his careful notes, boundary markers, water testing logs, soil readings. He'd kept everything. I added a new entry. Date, time, conversation summary, witnesses present, weather conditions, behavioral notes. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. The kind my father had relied on when dealing with stubborn contractors or county officials who pretended not to understand land rights. I snapped a photo of the entry, saved it in my digital folder labeled HOA dispute, then set the notebook aside. Outside, a burst of wind rattled the porch screens, and the sky dimmed briefly as a cloud drifted in front of the sun. The weather wasn't turning, but something else was. My phone buzzed on the counter. Another email notification. I opened it. Subject: Notice of community concern. Immediate attention required. The language inside was heavier, more formal than the earlier messages. Someone clearly wanted to create a paper trail. They accused me of blocking historic recreational access, displaying threatening posture toward residents, damaging community relations, and at the bottom, unsigned, a full discussion will occur at the upcoming HOA meeting. Attendance required. Required. For a man who wasn't even part of their HOA. I leaned a hand on the counter, breathing slowly. They were stacking their narrative, preparing the stage. The meeting was their arena, their comfort zone, the place where Bethany could grandstand with an audience behind her. But I wasn't walking into that room unarmed. I grabbed my phone and scrolled to the contact list until I found the number I hadn't used in nearly 3 years. Sarah Mitchell, attorney, land and water rights. My thumb hesitated a moment above the call button. Not out of doubt, only out of acknowledgement. Once I made this call, the fight shifted from irritation to full engagement. I pressed dial. The phone rang twice before she answered, her voice clear, crisp, the same steady cadence she'd had when we handled a water line dispute on my old property. Remy? Long time. What's happened? I told her everything. The invoice, the kayakers, the harassment disguised as neighborly concern, the meeting demand. Sarah didn't interrupt. I could almost hear her taking notes, her mind turning like gears inside a well-oiled machine. When I finished, she let out a slow exhale. They're setting up a false precedence claim, she said. If they convince enough residents the lake was historically shared, they'll try to use that to argue implied access. Not legally sound, but messy enough to cause you trouble. I figured, I said quietly. You did the right thing documenting everything. Don't engage emotionally. Don't argue. Don't give them anything to twist. She paused. I'll be there for the meeting. A weight lifted from my chest, replaced by something steadier. Resolve. After we hung up, I stepped outside again. The air was colder now, the sun ducking behind the ridge, shadows lengthening over the lake. The water shimmered in patches where the light still touched it. I walked to the shoreline and crouched down. The mud was cool beneath my fingers. The lake was quiet, unbothered. A mirror of what my life used to be, what it could be again once this storm passed. I rose slowly, brushing dirt from my hands. The wind carried a faint echo across the water, some distant noise from the direction of the HOA neighborhood. Laughter? Conversation? A dog barking? Hard to tell. Harder to care. I wasn't fighting this with anger. I was fighting it with patience, with records, with truth, with silence used like a shield, not a retreat. They thought I didn't know how to play their game, but I knew something they didn't. You don't win a Wyoming land fight by shouting. You win it by standing still while the other side digs their own hole. And the HOA was digging fast. I turned back toward the cabin, the long shadows stretching across the ground like dark arrows pointing the way forward. My boots brushed through pine needles scattered by the wind. The air tasted colder now, like the moment before nightfall, when the mountains inhaled and held their breath. I didn't know exactly how the meeting would unfold, or how far Bethany was willing to go, or what role Jake Mercer had in all of it. But I did know this. The silence was working, and soon enough, everything they'd been hiding would surface, just like silt rising from the deep when someone stirs the wrong part of the lake. The day of the HOA meeting arrived with a sky the color of brushed steel. Wyoming mornings usually carried a quiet promise, but that one felt different. Charged, unsettled, like the air right before a thunderstorm decides where to strike. The wind rolled in low gusts across the open field, scattering dust and bending the tips of the sagebrush. Even the crows seemed restless, hopping from fence post to fence post as I locked up the cabin and walked to my truck. The meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m., but I left early. Not because I was eager to go. If anything, I would have rather faced a January blizzard without boots. But Sarah Mitchell wanted time to prepare. She was already waiting outside the Pine Brook Community Center when I pulled into the gravel lot. Her posture was calm, controlled, her dark hair tied back against the wind. The moment I stepped out of the truck, she studied my face with that sharp attorney's eye of hers. "You ready?" she asked. "I'm here," I replied. "That'll have to be enough." She gave a faint smile. "You've done everything right so far. Just keep doing it. Let them show the room who they really are." We walked toward the building. Gravel crunched under our boots, and the wooden steps groaned as we ascended. The community center smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old carpet, its fluorescent lights humming overhead. Inside, metal chairs were arranged in tight rows, already half-filled even though we were early. Some residents whispered in clusters. Others sat alone, arms crossed, eyes narrowed with preformed opinions. A projector screen displayed a single slide in bold font. Cedar Lake Access Discussion. Community Preservation Matters. Preservation. Their favorite disguise. Bethany was already stationed at the long folding table up front. She wore a navy suit jacket and pearl earrings, her expression polite but glacial. 4 board members flanked her, each with a laptop open, as if this was some municipal proceeding and not a suburban power play. When she saw me enter, her smile tightened, thin, polite, brittle as frost. "Mr. Cole," she said, loud enough to draw attention. "Glad you decided to join us." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Sarah stepped forward before Bethany could twist silence into guilt. "We're here as invited," Sarah said evenly, "and prepared." Bethany's eyebrow twitched, almost imperceptibly. People kept filing in until there were nearly 60 residents in the room. The air felt packed, heavy with murmurs, shifting jackets, and the faint heat of too many bodies in a small space. The windows reflected the fading evening light, casting pale silver across the metal chair legs. Then Bethany stood. "Thank you all for coming," she began, projecting her voice with practiced confidence. "Tonight, we're addressing a matter that affects the character and heritage of our community. Cedar Lake has always been a place where families paddle, fish, and enjoy our shared environment." A few heads nodded. Others stayed still. She clicked the projector remote. A photo appeared on the screen, my no trespassing sign near the dock, zoomed in to make it look harsh, unfriendly. "In recent months," Bethany continued, "access has been restricted. Residents have been confronted. Long-standing community traditions have been threatened." Sarah leaned toward me and whispered, "She's performing. Watch her escalate." Bethany clicked again. This time, the slide showed a map, except someone had drawn a dotted line connecting the HOA boundary to the lake, as though proximity alone equaled ownership. "While Mr. Cole claims full control of the lake," she said, "the board believes this resource was intended for community use. Therefore, we're introducing Resolution 14B, requiring the property owner to restore access or sell Cedar Lake back to Pinebrook Meadows at fair market value." A low ripple moved through the room. Not approval, just surprise. Sarah rose. "Where did that fair market value come from?" she asked. Bethany didn't look at her. "Comparable water access sites." Sarah's tone stayed calm. "Was there an independent appraisal?" Bethany hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but enough for the room to feel it. "The board deemed an appraisal unnecessary," she said. And there it was. The first crack. I stood. The projector light washed over me as I walked to the front. The room quieted, and even Bethany stiffened slightly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point fingers. I simply connected my laptop to the cable dangling from the projector. The screen went black for a second. Then it lit up with the official 2023 county survey. Property lines outlined in thick red ink. Cedar Lake, entirely contained within my land. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is the actual surveyed boundary. Verified by the county. Filed with the deed. Every inch of Cedar Lake sits on private property. No easement. No historic grant. No shared rights." The room shifted. People leaned forward. Someone whispered, "That's not what Bethany said." I clicked again. Now the HOA's own jurisdiction map filled the screen, also excluding Cedar Lake. "You don't have authority over what isn't yours," I said, "and no vote in this room can change that." Another slide. A scanned copy of an old purchase offer from the HOA to the previous owner, Halverson. The same lake they were claiming today had been theirs traditionally. Gasps scattered through the room. Bethany's fingers tightened around her folder. She hadn't expected anyone else to have that document. I took a slow breath. "I've kept quiet," I said. "I haven't argued online. I haven't harassed neighbors. I haven't confronted anyone. I've documented everything. And every record shows the same truth." The projector hummed behind me like a steady heartbeat. The silence in the room was thick. "You don't get to rewrite the map," I added quietly. "You don't get to rewrite history, and you don't get to vote away private property." A woman in the second row raised her hand hesitantly. Is that real?" she asked, pointing toward the screen. "It is," Sarah answered before I could. "Every piece of it." Then a man stood, an older resident with weathered hands and a faded ball cap. I recognized him from the mailbox row. "Bethany," he said, his voice steady as the mountains behind us. "Why didn't you tell us the board tried to buy the lake before?" Bethany inhaled sharply. A bead of sweat traced down her temple, catching the light. "That information wasn't relevant," she started. "It's relevant now," he cut in. More voices rose. "I don't like being lied to." Why didn't we hear the whole story? What else aren't you telling us? The weight of the room shifted, leaning away from her. Bethany reached for the projector remote, maybe to switch slides, maybe to shut everything down. But her hand trembled, so faintly most would miss it. But not me. Her authority, so rehearsed and polished, had fractured. Another resident spoke up from the back. Where did the idea of selling it come from? That wasn't our suggestion. Bethany finally found her voice, but it wavered. The board discussed. No, the older man said firmly. You discussed. For the first time since I'd met her, Bethany Reed looked genuinely off balance. The wind outside rattled the window panes just then, a boom of air rolling across the siding like the mountains themselves were listening. Sarah leaned slightly toward me. This, she whispered, is how power breaks, not with shouting, but with truth dropped in the center of a room. I didn't smile, but a certain tightness inside my chest loosened. The lake outside was still mine. The facts were still mine. And now, finally, the room knew it too. But as the murmurs grew and Bethany struggled to regain control, there was one question lingering in the back of my mind. If she hadn't told the truth about the lake, what else had she been hiding? The meeting dissolved faster than anyone expected. What should have been a controlled showcase of HOA power had collapsed into a low, rumbling tide of confused voices and fractured trust. Some residents stood in small groups, whispering with their arms folded tightly across their chests. Others simply grabbed their coats and left without a word, the metal legs of the folding chairs screeching against the linoleum floor. Bethany tried calling for order 3 separate times. Each attempt failed harder than the last. By the time she finally adjourned the meeting, her voice had lost its shine, her posture rigid with embarrassment. She slipped out a side door, not even waiting for her board members. Sarah watched her leave with that quiet, analytical stare of hers, the kind she used when she sensed a bigger truth waiting just beneath the surface. We gathered our things in silence, letting the room thin out. The projector clicked off with a faint pop, the screen rolling up with a sluggish clatter. The community center's fluorescent lights flickered overhead like they were tired too. When we stepped outside, twilight had deepened into a soft, bruised blue. The lot was nearly empty except for a few cars that were slow to leave. Gravel crunched under our boots as we reached my truck. The wind carried the earthy smell of sage and the faint metallic tang of cold air settling in. That went better than I expected, Sarah said. I huffed a faint breath. I thought it went worse. She shook her head. Bethany lost control of the room. That's the one thing an HOA president can't afford. Before I could respond, a voice called out from behind us. Remy? Hold up a second. We turned. An older man walked toward us, tall, a little stooped, with a weathered face that looked like it had seen more Wyoming summers than HOA meetings. I recognized him from earlier, the man who'd spoken out against Bethany. He reached us with a slow, determined stride. Name's Don, he said, offering a hand. Don Sanders. Been living here since before Pine Brook even had sidewalks. I shook his hand. His grip was firm, calloused. I just wanted to say, Don continued, you did right in there. Folks needed to see the truth. Needed to see Bethany's been pulling strings we didn't know about. Sarah crossed her arms. Has she done this before? Don let out a dry laugh. She's always had an agenda. But lately, she's been worse. Busy, secretive, and she's been meeting with someone. My heart tapped once, hard. Who? He glanced around the parking lot as if someone might be listening. Tall fellow, sharp-dressed, nice truck. Shows up late evenings sometimes. They talk near the wetlands behind her house. I didn't breathe. Black pickup? I asked. Chrome trim? Tinted windows? Don nodded slowly. Yeah. You seen him? I exchanged a look with Sarah. Mercer. So you know who he is, Dawn said, reading the answer in our silence. I figured. Something about him felt off, like he wasn't here for neighborly reasons. He shifted his weight. The gravel crackled softly under his boots. Look, he said, lowering his voice. I've lived near Cedar Lake a long time, longer than anyone else here. Halverson, old owner, told me something once. Said the HOA wanted the lake years back, but he shut them down hard. He left the paperwork, I said quietly. I found it. Dawn nodded. Bethany was part of that push, and ever since you bought the place, she's been circling again like a hawk looking for an opening. He hesitated, then leaned in closer. And that developer, Mercer? He's the reason. The cold in the air deepened as he said the name. Bethany's been trying to impress him, Dawn went on. He wants the water rights, wants to build a resort or something, and Bethany's convinced herself that delivering the lake would make her look powerful, important. Sarah's jaw tightened. He needs the water rights to build. Without them, he's got nothing. Dawn nodded, and without you, he has them. A long silence stretched between us, filled only by the wind scraping across the gravel lot like a whisper. He made a pass through the neighborhood a week ago, Dawn added. Didn't introduce himself, didn't talk to anyone, just drove slow, looking at the lake like he already owned it. My pulse echoed through my ears, not fear, but clarity, a clean, sharp understanding settling into place. This wasn't a feud. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't even about the HOA anymore. This was a coordinated attempt to transfer the lake, my lake, to a developer waiting in the wings. And Bethany, with her rigid posture and polished persona, had been acting as the middleman. Sarah exhaled slowly. This explains everything. The pressure, the smear emails, the kayakers, manufactured tradition. They're building a narrative to justify a takeover disguised as community concern. Dawn looked at me with earnest, weathered eyes. Be careful, Remy. Folks like Mercer don't play fair. And Bethany, she wants power more than she wants peace. He gave a small nod, tipped his hat, and walked back to his truck. His tail lights glowed red as he pulled away, disappearing beyond the curve of the lot. The cold air felt heavier now, wrapped around me like a wet coat. I leaned against my truck door, staring at the dark silhouette of the ridge beyond the community center. Sarah broke the silence. We need to step up our timeline. I know. You need backup. I know that too. She crossed her arms. You should loop in law enforcement, not for confrontation, just for protection and clarity. I let out a slow breath. There was only one person I trusted for that, Sheriff Marcus Hale, a man who didn't see badges as weapons, but as responsibilities. A man who respected land boundaries more than most people respected their own fences. A man who knew the difference between law and intimidation and knew exactly how to deal with both. We'll call him first thing tomorrow, Sarah said, as if reading my thoughts. I nodded. As we climbed into my truck, the sky had deepened into full night. The stars were sparse behind a thin veil of cloud, and the moon cast a faint silver streak across the distant lake. Cedar Lake. Still mine. But the circle tightening around it was no longer just rumor or suspicion. It had a name, a motive, and a plan. The HOA wanted power. Mercer wanted water rights. Bethany wanted validation. And they were hoping I wouldn't see the trap until it closed. Too bad for them. The truth had already surfaced. The next morning dawned gray and cold, the kind of Wyoming morning where the wind carries a low hum that feels like a warning. Frost clung to the grass around the lake, turning each blade into a tiny shard of glass. The air smelled faintly of pine sap and distant wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Ordinary, quiet, almost peaceful, almost. Because beneath that winter stillness was something tightening, something Bethany and Mercer were depending on. Pressure. Social pressure. Legal-looking paperwork. Community whispers. It had worked on others before, but not today. By 7:15 a.m., I was outside, coffee steaming in one hand, phone in the other, dialing the only person whose voice I needed to hear right now. Sheriff Marcus Hale answered on the second ring. "Remy," he said, his tone steady as bedrock. "I wondered when you'd be calling." "You heard?" "I hear a lot of things, especially when folks start talking about lakes, easements, and HOA meetings that end with half the room walking out stiff as fence posts." I let out a slow breath. "Marcus, they're building a case against me, or trying to. Come by my office." There was no hesitation, no lecture, just that simple instruction. I grabbed my jacket, stepped into my truck, and drove toward town. The tires crunched over the gravel as I pulled away from the lake, each turn of the wheel stirring dust into the cold morning air. Pines flanked the road on both sides, their dark green needles shaking in the crosswind. When I reached the sheriff's office, Marcus was already waiting by the door, arms crossed, hat low, his badge catching a glint of pale sunlight. He wasn't a big man, but he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd seen real crimes, and knew the difference between troublemakers and people just trying to live in peace. Inside, he motioned me to a chair and closed the door behind us. "All right," he said, settling in across from me. "Start from the beginning." I laid everything out. The fake invoice, the kayakers, the smear emails, the community tradition campaign, the jam-packed HOA meeting, Don's warning, and the fact that developer Jake Mercer had been circling my lake like a buzzard. Marcus listened without interrupting, hands clasped on his desk, eyes narrowed in focus. When I finished, he leaned back, letting out a long breath. "Yeah," he said softly. "That tracks." He opened a drawer and pulled out a file. Thin, worn, edges crinkled. He slid it across the desk. I picked it up. Inside were complaints, old ones, years old, names I didn't recognize. Pages documenting boundary disputes, intimidation tactics, fines used as pressure tools. Even a family who'd moved away after unresolvable conflict with the HOA. "Bethany's been doing this a long time," Marcus said. "Most folks don't have the stomach to fight back. They sell, they leave. And then the properties get bought," I finished. "Cheap," he said. "Real cheap." A picture formed in my mind, the same picture Greg and Sarah had begun helping me piece together. "How long has Mercer been around?" I asked. "Long enough," Marcus replied. "He's not stupid. He uses people like Bethany to do the pushing, so his hands stay clean." I set the file down. "Marcus, I recorded everything, every interaction, every visitor on the property, every email is archived. I have deed copies, survey maps, water rights." His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Good," he said, "because that's exactly what you'll need." He stood and walked to a cabinet behind his desk, pulling out a clean form, an official notice. "What's that?" "A lawful freeze," he said. "It's a notice requiring the HOA to cease all property-related actions against you until the county can determine jurisdiction. They can't fine you, can't threaten you, can't convene any hearing about your lake. It stops their momentum." I blinked. "Just like that?" "Just like that," he said. "Look, Remy, you're not dealing with a powerful legal entity. You're dealing with a board that thinks it is one. The moment you shine real authority on them, they scatter." He signed the notice, stamped it, and slid it to me. "Take this to Sarah. She'll know how to serve it properly." My breath loosened a little, but Marcus wasn't done. "I'm also opening a preliminary investigation," he said. Anonymous threats, trespassing, possible collusion between a developer and an HOA president. Those aren't small things. A weight lifted from my chest, one I hadn't fully realized was there. Marcus, thank you. You didn't ask for trouble, he said, sitting back down. But trouble came anyway. And in this county, we don't let folks get run off their land by paperwork and politics. When I stepped outside, the sky had brightened. A thin ribbon of sunlight cut across the rooftops of Main Street, glowing warm against the cold morning air. I held the sheriff's notice in my hand like a small, quiet weapon, one made of law, not threat. I climbed into my truck, turned the ignition, and headed straight to Sarah's office. Her building sat near the courthouse, a sturdy brick structure with wide windows that let the winter light pour through. When I entered, she was already waiting at her desk, legal texts and folders spread out in precise, organized stacks. "You look like you got news," she said. I handed her the notice. Her eyebrows rose. "He signed this himself? Good. This gives us leverage." "More than leverage," I said. "He's opening an investigation." She exhaled, relieved but focused. "Then we need to move fast. The HOA will escalate once they realize you're not folding. They'll push harder. They always do before they break." For the rest of the day, Sarah and I built our case. Every email, every recording, every map, every legal reference. It was all spread across her long oak conference table, looking almost like a battlefield diagram built from paper, ink, and truth. By the time evening settled, a pale gold sunset washed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. We had the sheriff's freeze notice prepped, legal citations printed, a clean timeline drafted. "Tomorrow morning," Sarah said, "we serve the HOA." I nodded. "And Mercer?" "He'll feel it," she said. "Pressure works both ways." When I drove home, the sky had gone deep violet, dotted with early stars. The gravel road leading to my lake crunched beneath the tires, the familiar sound grounding me after a long day. I parked near the boathouse and walked down to the dock. The lake reflected the sky, dark, still, unbothered by the chaos unfolding around it. I let the cold wind brush against my face, carrying the scent of wet pine and the echo of distant owls. They had tried to corner me. They had tried to intimidate me. They had tried to paint me as an outsider. But the sheriff was now involved. The law was on my side, and the truth was no longer just mine. It was documented, verified, and ready to be used. Far across the lake, on the opposite ridge, a pair of headlights appeared for a moment, then disappeared. I didn't flinch. Let them watch. Let them worry. Tonight, for the first time, they weren't the hunters. I was. The next morning broke cleaner and brighter than any day in weeks. Sunlight poured over the ridge like a slow spilling ribbon of gold, warming the frost on the pine needles until thin trails of steam rose in the air. The lake reflected it all, sharp, glassy, calm. A quiet steadiness settled over the water, as if Cedar Lake itself knew this was the day everything shifted. I stepped out onto my porch with the sheriff's freeze notice in one hand and a stack of neatly organized documents in the other. Survey maps, water rights filings, email printouts, the deed, freshly certified by the county, stamped in red. Sarah had instructed me to bring everything. Truth, she'd said, always walks taller when it's fully armed. By 8:30 a.m., I was pulling into the HOA office parking lot, Sarah's car right behind me. The building was small, more like a converted ranger station than the headquarters of a community board. But with all the trouble Bethany had stirred, it might as well have been a fortress. We walked inside together. Bethany wasn't at the front desk. Instead, two board members sat stiffly behind a counter, faces drawn tight. The younger one, maybe in his early 30s, watched us with nervous eyes. Sarah spoke first. "We're here to serve an official notice." Her voice was crisp enough to cut through the air. The older board member sighed. "Bethany isn't in today." "She doesn't need to be," Sarah replied, placing the freeze notice gently on the counter. "This is effective immediately." He looked down at the document. His face drained. You brought the sheriff into this?" I answered plainly. "No, Bethany did." The younger man swallowed hard, pushing his chair back slightly as if something had physically struck him. The freeze notice sat between us like a quiet thunderclap. No raised voices, no threats, just the weight of law laid bare. Sarah slid the rest of the evidence across the counter. "You will provide the full HOA meeting minutes from the last 5 years," she said. "You will cease all harassment, all fines, all fabricated complaints, and you will schedule a public correction at the next community session." The older man's voice was barely a whisper. This is going to blow everything open." "It already has," I said. We left the documents on the counter and walked back out into the sunlight. 3 days later, the emergency meeting took place. The community center parking lot overflowed. Dozens of cars, trucks, and SUVs squeezed into every corner. Folks stood in clumps outside, whispering, staring at the entrance as if waiting for a storm to hit. Inside, the air felt thick enough to chew. When I walked in, the conversations dipped into sudden silence. Some people nodded respectfully. Others avoided my eyes, uneasy with the realization that they'd been following a leader who had lied to them for months. Bethany sat at the front table. Or rather, she sat rigidly at the front table, her posture a brittle imitation of the poise she once wore like armor. Today, though, the armor had cracks. A big one sat right beside her, in the form of an empty chair, with the nameplate, Treasurer, vacant. Jake Mercer wasn't in the room. His absence spoke louder than his presence ever could. The meeting opened with trembling formalities sent from one of the surviving board members. He shuffled through his stack of notes like a man holding a live wire. The sheriff's office has issued a jurisdictional freeze. We legally cannot enforce any action against Mr. Cole or Cedar Lake." Whispers rippled across the room. Bethany clenched her jaw so tightly her teeth could have cracked. The board member continued. "An investigation is underway regarding prior actions. We will be cooperating fully." He looked ready to shrink into his own shoulders. Finally, he gestured to me. "Mr. Cole, the floor is yours." I walked to the projector, carrying the same binder I'd used at the previous meeting, but this time, there was no tremor in my breath, no tension gripping my chest. The truth was heavy but solid. I placed the deed on the overhead display. Its red county stamp glowed under the lamp. "This is my lake," I said softly. "It has always been private land. It has never belonged to the HOA, not once, not on any map, any survey, any covenant." Silence. I changed the display to the survey map. Clear boundaries, lines drawn decades before Pinebrook Meadows existed. "And all of you," I continued, turning toward the room, "were told it did." A few residents lowered their eyes. Others stared at Bethany with cold disappointment. Then Don Sanders stood up. "I knew she was hiding something," he said loudly. "But not this." More murmurs, louder now. Sarah stepped forward and addressed the room. "There will be legal consequences for the fabricated violations, for the unauthorized actions taken by certain members of this board, and for the developer influence that appears to have been involved." Bethany's head snapped toward her. "There was no influence." Sarah held up a single email printout. "Then explain this." The room fell dead silent again. It was the message Don had told me about, the one showing a meeting between Bethany and Mercer regarding access pathways and long-term utilization benefits. Bethany's face went pale. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. But no sound came. People in the crowd began speaking, one after another. "You lied to us. You tried to take his land. You wanted the lake sold. You made us think he was the problem." Bethany's composure finally cracked. The controlled, polished woman who used to command every room now looked small, cornered by the very people she thought she could manipulate. When she finally rose from her seat, her voice shook. "I did what I thought was best for the neighborhood." "No," someone called from the back. "You did what was best for yourself." The board voted right then and there. Unanimous. Bethany was removed as HOA president, effective immediately. She gathered her papers with trembling hands and walked out of the room. No applause followed her exit. No sympathetic murmurs. Just the soft sound of the door closing behind her and the echo of consequences she'd never expected to face. A week later, Mercer officially withdrew from any development plans in the county. Sarah called to tell me the news. "A developer without water rights," she said, "is just a man with paperwork and big ideas." The HOA issued a formal apology. The fines were voided. Every false allegation was withdrawn. A new board was elected, this time led by people who actually believed in fairness. And me? I went back to the lake. On a quiet morning, much like the one when all of this began, I stood on my dock, feeling the soft Wyoming breeze push lightly across my shoulders. The water rippled in small, gentle waves, like the lake was breathing again. I cast my line into the clear, cold water. No crowds, no arguments, no HOA president marching across my dock in high heels. Just the steady rhythm of the lake I had fought to protect. A win without celebration. Just peace returning to where it always belonged. The lake was never theirs. It never would be. And now, everyone finally knew it. Sometimes standing your ground is quiet work, but it still matters. If you've ever had to fight for what's yours, drop a simple yes in the comments so folks know they're not alone. And if you'd like to hear more stories about justice, land, and the people who don't back down, feel free to subscribe and stay with us.